Hi, this tutorial is to show you how I would do editing in Lightroom. And you can see I'm using Lightroom for most of the basics here apply to previous versions as well. And specifically, one of the tools that I'm going to use here is the brush tool. And I really want to encourage you to use the brush tool. It's a very powerful element here, and it's going to make your overall edits much stronger and make your images look more polished. Now here's an image that I took, and it's a landscape obviously, and you can see that it's relatively washed out. It's pretty low contrast, and there's a couple of things that you can see when you look at the histogram. First of all, the left side doesn't come all the way over to the left, the right side doesn't go all the way over to the right. That is the first area that you're going to want to address for something like this. So first we're going to move the exposure over a little bit, push everything a little bit over to the right, and you obviously don't want to clip anything here because then you're going to lose detail, but as long as you don't have any highlight clipping here, and if I had it, you would see little areas where the red starts to pop up. So that's going too far, but we can bring this back, and as long as we don't see any of that red clipping, we're in good shape. We can turn on the shadow clipping too, and that's going to show up as a blue overlay. Now what you can see here, we brightened everything up. That's making the white of the solar generating fan here very nice and bright without losing detail. Now what you're going to find here is once we start adjusting this black point, our colors are going to be very much more rich. Everything's going to look more saturated, and that's a very important next step. Now the way these sliders work is, of course, if you move things over to the right, it's going to make things brighter, it's going to be more exposed. If you move things to the left, it's going to make it darker and less exposed. So while we move the exposure over to the right, here we want the blacks to be richer, so we're going to move this over to the left. Now if you watch the histogram as we're going, you can see this is much more we're going to have much higher contrast rather, and the colors already look a lot more saturated. Now just to give you an idea what that looked like again before and after real quick, we'll start with the rectangle because that's what I showed you. Already that's a big improvement. Now again, you can see with the shadow clipping on, there's a little bit, and if you look, it's just a little bit right here in the grass, a little bit right here in this ridge where the line of grass here is in a little bit of shadow. That's probably okay for this particular image, so I'm going to leave it like it is. Now obviously if we had big areas like this, then that would be too far. You know, that makes the sky look really nice, but we're definitely too dark down here. And of course if you click on that again, you can turn off the overlay, you can see it. So we're going to bring this back up a little bit and get a nice sort of compromise. Now if you think that you want to have maybe even a little bit more contrast, the next thing that you might do is move the shadows. Now with the black and with the exposure, what we're doing is we're moving the ends of the histogram. With the shadows and with the highlights, we're moving this next section right in. So we're much less likely to actually lose any information to clipping. So here we can move that a little bit, we can move that, and you can see how it is. We eventually will start to clip a little bit, but we can get some more contrast without really adjusting anything else too much. And of course the contrast slider itself can be used to add some contrast. Next thing we're going to do is add a little bit of clarity, and that's going to give you a perception of sharpness. Vibrance here is going to give you some additional saturation without making colors that are already saturated become oversaturated. Now the next thing that I would do is zip on down here to the Hsl palette, and now this is where I like to work on the sky. Now there's two things that I want to use in conjunction with each other. First, the luminance. If you click on the little circle that activates this palette, and the real power of this palette here is that once that's active, you can put your mouse over an area, click and drag up, it's going to make those brighter, click and drag down, it's going to make it darker. And the really cool thing about this is it will read the color information in that pixel, and it will only adjust colors that are in that range. So here, before we started, everything was 0. You can see that I had some aqua in there, and you can see I had some blue in there. And so only those 2 colors were changed. The next step is to go to saturation, and where with the luminance I moved them down a little bit, with the saturation I want to move them up just a little bit, and that's going to make that sky just a little bit darker, a little bit richer. And the next thing I want to do is maybe the same sort of thing here with some of these greens, and we'll just click and drag up just a little bit and bring some of these greens just down a little bit. And I think that we're in pretty good shape here. Now, for the sake of this tutorial, what I want to do is blow out this just a little bit, because I want to use the brush tool and show you how to use that. So I'm going to push my exposure up just a little bit more, so you can see, well, everything here is pretty bright. Maybe I'll adjust the sky here just a little bit more. Whoops. We're going to do an undo there. And of course you can also do it in the history, just move it back a layer. I mistakenly clicked on all instead of luminance, so we're going to bring this down just a little bit, so where we were. Turn this palette back off. Now we're going to use the adjustment brush. Now it's really very useful to keep this overlay on when you're doing these kind of techniques. And if you click right here, you can see exposure is the one that I had selected, but there are a number of other techniques that you can do, and these, you can think of these as really kind of like as presets. So if you know you want to adjust the local saturation, local clarity, or local sharpness, then you can select those, and it's going to pre-select some of these options here. And of course the other thing you can do is you can just make your own edits and make it a complete custom modification. When you're using the brush tool, the way that I always will recommend that you do it is really move your brush, your slider way over beyond what you think that you're going to do. This is going to allow you to very easily see what you're doing, and once you have your brush painted in just exactly right, then you move this back up and you find the right balance for this particular image. Now here you can see I've got my flow way up, I've got my density way up, and my feather way up. This isn't how I recommend that you do this. Now having a relatively feathered image is a good thing. It's going to give you a nice effect. You don't have to be quite so accurate in the way that you're brushing. But with the flow at 100 and the density at 100, then it's going to be pretty much an on or an off kind of effect with a little bit of a feather at the end. So here you can see with the brush, we've got the circle right in the middle that's bright white, and that's going to be the area that's on or off. And then you see the circle that's a little bit more gray. The area between the bright circle and the gray circle is going to be more feathered. If we move the flow and the density down to somewhere in the 50% range, then the whole thing is going to be a little bit more feathered, and you're going to have an easier job with these tools. Now the next thing you want to do is of course zoom in. These things are always better done at 100%, and of course you also want your brush to be more or less the size of what you're editing. So again, we've got the clipping overlay on. Here the only thing we're going to work on is the exposure, and we're going to paint until those little red overlays go away. Now again, you can see I made these gray marks because I have this exposure down way too far, but we're going to adjust that again after the effect, after we do our initial brushing here. So you can see the highlights go away really easy. And now if we zoom back out, you can see, okay, there's a little bit left here. We're going to zoom in. And maybe just a little bit up here. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to bring these up and find the balance where we don't have very much clipping and we don't see any strong lines where we made our edits. I think we still have a little bit of a strong line here. And this might be the case where it'd be easier to do two separate points. I did all of this on one point. And if we zoom out, if you click on the dot, you can see the overlay of where I was brushing. If you have two areas that have a significant difference in the amount of editing you need to do, you might be better off doing those edits with two separate points, and then it's just a matter of clicking on new. That's basically how I would do these kind of edits. I'd approach them. You can see it's a relatively straightforward process using the brush tool to modify your exposures, and the gradient actually works exactly the same way as the brush tool, only as obviously as a gradient instead of doing individual points. And using the Hsl palette. Now the one last thing I wanted to point out is the remove chromatic aberration tool. I have it deselected here, but chromatic aberration is something that you're going to get in areas that have very high contrast. And this particular image doesn't really have much in the way of chromatic aberration. And when you have a quality lens, it's going to minimize it, but you can never really get rid of it completely in certain situations. This looks pretty good here. What I'd like to recommend that you do is if you're using Lightroom 4, click on this for all of your images. That's going to turn this on by default, and if you have chromatic aberration, it's going to take care of it. If you don't have it, there's really no downside to turning it on. It's a very, very powerful tool, and here you can see a little bit of chromatic aberration. There's a little bit of purple fringing here, a little bit of cyan. You can see this is actually one of the instances where having it on maybe introduces a little bit. You want to turn it off. But for the vast majority of your images, having it on is not going to hurt. And again, it's one of those things. You look to see if it helps your image. If it does, leave it on. If there's areas where it's helping, then leave it on or turn it off as needed. But definitely check to see if you have chromatic aberration when you're working with an image that has a high contrast. So that's pretty much it. Let me know if you have any questions.